To understand this clash, we must first travel back in history, because conflicts like this do not erupt overnight. They are built over decades, sometimes generations. Before 1979, the relationship between Iran and Israel was not one of open hostility. In fact, under the rule of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Iran maintained diplomatic and economic ties with Israel. There was cooperation in trade, intelligence, and regional strategy. Both nations, though different in identity and culture, found common ground in shared geopolitical interests. Iran was seen as part of a regional alignment that included Western powers, and Israel was not viewed as an immediate enemy by Tehran's leadership at the time. But everything changed with the 1979 Islamic Revolution. When Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini rose to power, Iran underwent a complete ideological transformation. The new leadership rejected the Shah's Western alliances and redefined Iran's identity as a revolutionary Islamic state. In this new world view, Israel was no longer a strategic partner. It was seen as an illegitimate occupier of Palestinian land and a symbol of Western influence in the Muslim world. The rhetoric became sharper, the policies more confrontational. Diplomatic ties were severed. Israel's embassy in Tehran was handed over to representatives of the Palestine Liberation Organization. The message was clear: the relationship had shifted from cooperation to resistance. From that point onward, the conflict was not merely political, it became ideological. Iran positioned itself as a defender of the Palestinian cause, framing its opposition to Israel as a moral and religious duty. Israel, on the other hand, viewed the revolutionary government in Tehran as a regime committed to its destruction. Over time, this ideological divide hardened into strategic hostility. Iran began supporting groups that opposed Israel militarily, particularly in Lebanon and Gaza. Israel, perceiving an expanding Iranian influence across the region, responded with intelligence operations and targeted military actions aimed at limiting Tehran's reach. What makes this historical shift so important is that it explains why tensions today are so deeply rooted. This is not a disagreement over a single border or one political event. It is the result of decades of distrust, competing narratives, and opposing visions for the future of the Middle East. Each side sees the other not just as a rival, but as a fundamental threat to its security and identity. And when conflicts are framed in such existential terms, compromise becomes far more difficult. Understanding this transformation from quiet cooperation to entrenched hostility allows us to see that the current clashes are the surface expression of a much deeper fracture. The seeds were planted in 1979, and they continue to shape the political and military calculations of both nations today. History teaches us that when ideology and geopolitics collide, the consequences echo for generations. When we move beyond the historical roots, we begin to see that this clash is not simply about politics or territory. It is about vision, ideology, and influence. At its core, this is a struggle over what the Middle East should look like and who gets to shape its future. After the revolution, Iran did not merely change its foreign policy, it adopted a worldview. It saw itself as a revolutionary force, one that would challenge Western dominance and stand in opposition to what it considered injustice in the region, particularly regarding the Palestinian issue. Israel, meanwhile, views itself as a sovereign state fighting for survival in a region where it has often faced hostility. And so, both nations operate from narratives that reinforce confrontation rather than compromise. For Iran, opposition to Israel is not framed as a temporary political stance. It is woven into its revolutionary identity. Supporting the Palestinian cause became central to its regional messaging. This is why Iran has invested heavily in alliances and partnerships with groups that oppose Israel militarily and politically. These alliances are not random, they are strategic. They extend Iran's influence beyond its borders without requiring conventional warfare. Through networks in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Gaza, Iran projects power indirectly. This approach gives Tehran leverage while avoiding the full cost of open war. From Israel's perspective, this expanding web of influence feels like encirclement. Imagine being a small nation geographically, surrounded by actors who openly question your legitimacy. Israeli leaders often describe Iran's regional activity as an existential threat. It is not just the rhetoric that alarms them, but the missiles, the drones, the military training, and the financial support flowing to armed groups on Israel's borders. For Israel, preventing Iran from establishing a permanent military presence in neighboring territories is seen as a matter of national survival. Then there is the nuclear question, which intensifies everything. Iran insists that its nuclear program is for peaceful energy purposes, yet many in Israel and the West fear that it could eventually lead to weaponization. For Israel, the idea of a hostile regional power acquiring nuclear capability is unacceptable. This fear shapes its security doctrine. It explains preemptive strikes, covert operations, and persistent diplomatic pressure. On the other side, Iran views external opposition to its nuclear program as an attempt to weaken and control it. Each side interprets the other's defensive actions as aggression, creating a cycle of suspicion. What makes this rivalry particularly dangerous is that it blends ideology with strategy. When political disputes are mixed with religious symbolism and existential language, they become harder to diffuse. Leaders speak not just about policy disagreements, but about identity, destiny, and survival. And when people believe their very existence is at stake, they are less willing to step back. So this clash is not only about missiles or military bases. It is about competing visions of order in the region, about influence, legitimacy, and power. And as long as those visions remain fundamentally opposed, tension will remain just beneath the surface, waiting for the next spark. As tensions deepened over ideology and regional influence, the issue that truly accelerated this conflict into dangerous territory was the question of military power, especially nuclear capability. You see, in modern geopolitics, perception is often just as powerful as reality. And when one nation believes another is approaching a level of power that could permanently shift the balance, fear begins to drive policy. For Israel, Iran's advancing nuclear program represents exactly that kind of shift. Iran maintains that its nuclear development is for peaceful purposes, energy production, medical research, technological advancement. And under international frameworks, countries do have the right to pursue civilian nuclear programs. Inspections have been carried out by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and debates continue about compliance, enrichment levels, and transparency. But here is where perception matters. Israel does not measure the threat based solely on stated intentions. It measures it based on potential capability. In its strategic thinking, even the possibility that Iran could one day produce a nuclear weapon is seen as an unacceptable risk. This fear is not abstract. Israel is a relatively small country geographically, and its leaders often speak in terms of survival. The memory of past wars, regional hostility, and existential threats shapes its national doctrine. That is why we have seen reports of targeted strikes against nuclear facilities, cyber operations, and intelligence campaigns aimed at slowing or disrupting Iran's progress. These actions are framed as preventive measures designed not to provoke war, but to stop what is viewed as a looming catastrophe. On the other side, Iran sees these actions as aggression. From Tehran's perspective, it is being denied technological progress while other regional powers maintain advanced arsenals. Iranian officials argue that external pressure, sanctions, and covert operations prove that the real goal is not nuclear safety, but political containment. When sanctions are imposed, particularly by powers like the United States, Iran interprets them as part of a broader strategy to weaken its sovereignty and influence. And so the cycle continues. Israel fears Iran's capabilities. Iran resents Israel's interventions. Each missile test, each airstrike, each enrichment announcement becomes a signal interpreted through layers of suspicion. What might be described by one side as defensive is seen by the other as escalatory. Add to this the development of advanced missile systems and drone technology, and the stakes rise even higher. These are not theoretical tools, they are weapons that have already been used in limited exchanges and regional confrontations. The danger here is not only in the weapons themselves, but in the narrowing margin for error. When military technology advances faster than diplomacy, miscalculations become more likely. A single strike can trigger retaliation. Retaliation can spiral into open conflict, and when nuclear capability hovers in the background, even conventional clashes feel amplified. This is why the nuclear and military dimension of this conflict is so central. It transforms rivalry into potential catastrophe, because when power is measured in megatons and missile ranges, one misstep can change the course of history. For many years, this conflict rarely looked like a conventional war between two nations facing each other directly on a battlefield. Instead, it unfolded in shadows, through intermediaries, across borders that were not officially acknowledged as front lines. This is what we mean when we speak about proxy confrontations. Iran and Israel were not always striking each other openly. They were engaging through networks, alliances, and regional actors who carried the weight of confrontation on their soil. In Lebanon, for example, the presence of Hezbollah has been central to this dynamic. Backed and supported by Iran, Hezbollah has developed significant military capabilities over the years. From Israel's perspective, this represents a northern front that could be activated at any moment. Rockets, missiles, and fortified positions near the border are not abstract concerns. They are tangible security calculations. Every escalation in southern Lebanon is viewed through the lens of Iran's broader influence. In Gaza, groups such as Hamas have also received varying degrees of support from Tehran. While these groups operate within their own local political realities, their confrontation with Israel inevitably feeds into the larger Iran-Israel rivalry. When rockets are launched from Gaza or tensions flare in Jerusalem, the ripple effects extend far beyond those immediate locations. Israel often interprets such events not merely as isolated incidents, but as pieces of a larger strategic puzzle. And then there is Syria. Over the past decade, Syria has become one of the most critical arenas of indirect confrontation. Iranian forces and allied militias established positions there during the Syrian civil war. Israel responded with numerous airstrikes targeting weapons depots, military infrastructure, and personnel linked to Iranian operations. These strikes were calculated meant to prevent entrenchment without triggering full-scale war, yet each strike carried the risk of retaliation, and each retaliation risked broader escalation. What makes the current phase different is that the line between proxy engagement and direct confrontation has begun to blur. Missile launches and drone attacks have, at times, moved beyond third-party territories and into more direct exchanges. The distance that once allowed both sides plausible deniability is shrinking. Technology has made retaliation faster and more visible. Social media amplifies every explosion, every interception, every statement. The psychological dimension of warfare is now global and instantaneous. This shift is significant because proxy conflicts, while dangerous, often contain built-in buffers. Direct confrontation removes those buffers. When two states openly strike one another, national pride, public opinion, and political pressure intensify. Leaders feel compelled to respond firmly, lest they appear weak. And when responses are shaped by domestic expectations as much as strategic calculation, escalation becomes harder to control. We are witnessing a transformation from shadow conflict to increasingly overt hostility. And history teaches us that when rivals move from indirect skirmishes to direct blows, the path back to de-escalation becomes far steeper. Because once the shadows fade and the confrontation stands in the open, the consequences become impossible to contain. As this conflict intensifies, we must understand that it does not exist in isolation. It does not remain confined to two borders or two governments. The Middle East is a region woven together by alliances, rivalries, trade routes, and shared security concerns. When tension rises between Iran and Israel, the tremors are felt far beyond Tehran and Tel Aviv. One of the most immediate dimensions of this wider impact is the involvement of global powers. The United States has long been a close ally of Israel, providing military aid, intelligence cooperation, and diplomatic backing. Whenever confrontation escalates, Washington is inevitably drawn into the conversation, whether through public statements, military positioning, or efforts at deterrence. On the other side, Iran maintains strategic relationships with countries such as Russia, particularly in military and regional coordination. While these powers may not seek direct involvement, their interests and alliances mean that any serious escalation carries international implications. Then there is the matter of geography and global economics. The Middle East is not just a political crossroads, it is an energy artery for the world. The Strait of Hormuz, for example, is one of the most critical maritime passages on the planet. A significant portion of the world's oil supply flows through that narrow stretch of water. Whenever tensions involving Iran rise, markets react. Shipping routes become cautious. Insurance costs increase. Even rumors of disruption can send shockwaves through global economies. What begins as a regional security issue quickly transforms into a matter of worldwide financial concern. Neighboring countries also find themselves navigating a delicate balance. Gulf states weigh their security partnerships against the risk of provoking Iran. Lebanon stands vulnerable because of Hezbollah's position. Syria remains a staging ground of competing influences. Iraq often finds itself caught between American and Iranian spheres of influence. Each nation must calculate its moves carefully, aware that missteps could draw it deeper into confrontation. Beyond governments and military alliances, ordinary people across the region feel the consequences. Tourism declines when instability rises, investment slows. Young generations grow up in an environment where uncertainty feels normal. The psychological cost of living under the shadow of potential war is immense. Even countries not directly involved must adjust their domestic security measures, prepare for refugee flows, or brace for economic turbulence. And let us not forget the diplomatic arena. International organizations and mediators step in, attempting to calm tensions, propose ceasefires, or revive agreements. Yet diplomacy becomes increasingly complex when mistrust runs deep, and when each side believes it must project strength. The more global actors become entangled, the harder it is to craft a simple bilateral solution. This is why the clash between Iran and Israel is not merely a bilateral dispute. It is a node in a larger web of power, economics, and security that stretches across continents. When two regional rivals move closer to open confrontation, the entire world feels the tremor. After examining the history, the ideology, the military escalation, the proxy confrontations, and the regional consequences, we must now bring our focus to the most important dimension of all: human cost and the fragile pursuit of diplomacy. Because beyond the strategies and statecraft, beyond the missiles and headlines, there are ordinary men, women, and children whose lives are permanently altered by every escalation. When rockets are launched or airstrikes are carried out, it is not abstract targets that feel the impact first. It is neighborhoods, families, and communities. In Israel, civilians rush to shelters as warning sirens pierce the air. In Lebanon, in Gaza, in Syria, families brace themselves for retaliation and counter-retaliation. Fear becomes routine. Parents explain explosions to their children. Businesses close. Schools suspend classes. Trauma lingers long after the smoke clears. The psychological burden of living under constant threat reshapes entire generations. Economic consequences follow closely behind. Sanctions imposed on Iran have strained its economy for years, affecting inflation, employment, and access to goods. At the same time, Israel allocates vast resources to defense systems, intelligence operations, and military readiness. Money that could strengthen infrastructure, healthcare, or education is redirected towards survival. In neighboring states entangled in this rivalry, instability discourages investment and tourism. The ripple effect touches livelihoods far removed from political decision making. And yet, even in the midst of hostility, diplomacy never fully disappears. There have been negotiations, indirect talks, ceasefire arrangements, and international mediation efforts. Agreements have been drafted and, at times, implemented, though often temporarily. Organizations like the United Nations attempt to facilitate dialogue and reduce tensions. Back-channel communications quietly operate behind the scenes, even when public rhetoric remains fiery. Diplomacy is often slow, frustrating, and imperfect, but it remains the only sustainable alternative to perpetual conflict. The challenge, however, lies in trust. Decades of suspicion cannot be erased overnight. Each side questions the intentions of the other. Concessions are viewed with skepticism. Domestic politics also complicate matters. Leaders must consider how negotiations will be perceived by their own citizens. In such an environment, even small steps toward de-escalation require courage and political risk. But here is the reality. Military victories are rarely absolute in conflicts rooted in ideology and identity. Airstrikes may delay programs, sanctions may pressure economies, retaliation may restore temporary deterrence. Yet none of these measures address the underlying narratives that fuel hostility. Without dialogue, even difficult, uncomfortable dialogue, the cycle simply continues. The human toll reminds us why diplomacy, however fragile, must remain on the table. Because while governments calculate strategy, it is ordinary people who carry the consequences. And every escalation deepens wounds that will take years to heal. In the end, the true measure of strength will not be who can strike harder, but who can choose a path that preserves life over pride.